Nature has been screaming at us for centuries. We nodded, smiled, and walked straight into the disaster anyway. Here are 31 times the warning was loud, clear, and completely ignored. 1. Coral reefs have been turning white for decades, and for a long time, the tourism boards called it a unique photo opportunity. That sentence should be illegal. Coral bleaching is not a mood. It is not a cycle. It is a physiological stress response, and by the time the reef looks like a ghostly underwater cemetery, the damage is already well underway. Here's what actually happens. When water temperatures rise even 1 or 2 degrees Celsius above the seasonal maximum for an extended period, coral expels the symbiotic algae living in its tissue, the algae that provides up to 90% of the coral's energy. Without it, the coral starves. It turns white, becomes immune compromised, and if temperatures don't return to normal within weeks, it dies and gets colonized by algae that turns it green, then black. The Great Barrier Reef experienced mass bleaching events in 1998, 2002, 2016, 2017, 2020, and 2022. That is 6 events in 24 years. Reefs need roughly 10 to 15 years to recover between bleaching events. Back-to-back events give them essentially zero recovery time, which is exactly what happened in 2016 and 2017, an event scientists explicitly called unprecedented. The 1998 global bleaching event alone, triggered by a powerful El Niño, killed approximately 16% of the world's coral reefs in a single year. Government officials and industry groups publicly framed it as a one-off anomaly. Scientists began formally documenting and warning about mass bleaching as a climate-linked threat in the early 1980s. Those warnings were deprioritized in international climate policy for over a decade because the economics of reef-adjacent tourism were more immediately legible than the ecology. The Coral Triangle in Southeast Asia, home to 75% of the world's coral species and a direct food source for over 120 million people, has lost an estimated 40% of its coral coverage since the 1980s. Recent modeling suggests that at 2 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels, 99% of the world's coral reefs will bleach annually. Not occasionally, annually, permanently. Dismissing coral bleaching as a natural cycle is like watching your house slowly fill with smoke, deciding its atmospheric ambiance, and repainting the walls while the wiring burns. 2. In the 1960s, Soviet central planners looked at one of the world's 4 largest lakes and decided the water was being wasted by just sitting there. The Aral Sea covered approximately 68,000 square kilometers and was teeming with fish, supporting a commercial industry that employed roughly 60,000 people and produced 40,000 tons of catch per year. The plan was to divert the 2 rivers feeding it, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, to irrigate cotton fields across Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Officials called it a triumph of human engineering over nature's inefficiency. Nature had a different interpretation. The irrigation systems were famously terrible, with estimates suggesting up to 75% of diverted water was lost to evaporation and seepage before it even reached the crops. Within a decade of major diversion, the fish were gone. The fishing industry that had built entire communities vanished completely by the 1980s. But the sea didn't just shrink. It poisoned what it left behind. As the water receded, it exposed a vast lake bed saturated with pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer residue from decades of agricultural runoff. Winds now distribute that toxic dust across hundreds of miles, producing dramatically elevated rates of throat cancer, respiratory disease, and infant mortality in surrounding communities. The loss of the sea's thermal mass also fundamentally altered the regional microclimate, making winters colder, summers hotter, and the growing season shorter, which ironically reduced the productivity of the very agriculture the diversion was meant to support. Soviet scientists privately raised concerns about the diversion's consequences as early as the 1960s. Those reports were suppressed because admitting the problem would have required admitting the policy was catastrophically wrong. By 2007, the sea had shrunk to roughly 10% of its original volume. The southern basin had essentially become a series of disconnected, brine-poisoned pools surrounded by a toxic salt flat, populated by rusting ship hulls sitting miles from any water. Kazakhstan has since partially restored the smaller northern basin using a dam built with World Bank funding, and some fish have returned. The southern basin remains a desert. Draining the Aral Sea for cotton is the geopolitical equivalent of burning your house down to stay warm for one winter and then acting confused when you're cold and homeless the following year. 3. The popular framing of the 1930s Dust Bowl has always been that it was a tragic natural disaster, a brutal drought that devastated an unlucky region. That framing is doing an enormous amount of protective work for a catastrophe that was, in fact, overwhelmingly man-made. The Great Plains grasslands had evolved over millions of years with shallow-rooted, drought-tolerant grasses whose dense root systems held topsoil in place even during extended dry periods. Indigenous communities had managed this landscape sustainably for centuries. Then the Homestead Acts arrived, bringing mass agricultural settlement driven by government incentives and a brief period of unusually wet weather that produced the dangerously wrong belief that rain follows the plow. Between 1900 and 1930, settlers broke up approximately 100 million acres of native grassland. When drought hit in the early 1930s, there was no root system left to hold the exposed, pulverized topsoil. A single dust storm in April of 1934 moved an estimated 350 million tons of topsoil from the Great Plains, depositing it as far east as Washington, D.C., and on ships in the Atlantic Ocean. The so-called black blizzards, massive walls of dust sometimes reaching 10,000 feet high, buried farm equipment, suffocated livestock, and caused a disease called dust pneumonia that killed a substantial number of people, particularly children. Approximately 3.5 million people were displaced from the Great Plains, one of the largest internal migrations in American history. Agricultural scientists and government soil experts had been warning about overplowing and soil degradation throughout the 1920s. Their reports were largely ignored because land prices were rising and wheat was profitable. The economics drowned out the ecology, which is a sentence that has aged remarkably poorly and kept getting recycled. The Soil Conservation Service was established in 1935 and introduced contour plowing, windbreaks, and crop rotation. When comparable drought conditions hit the same region in the 1950s, farmers who applied these techniques did not experience an ecological collapse. The methods worked. They just arrived one catastrophe too late for the people who needed them first. Calling the Dust Bowl a natural disaster is like blaming the match for burning down a house you built out of newspaper and soaked in gasoline. Nature struck the spark. Humans built the fuel. 4. In the 1930s and 40s, the United States government did not merely permit kudzu to spread across the South. It actively paid farmers to plant it. Brochures called it a wonder vine. Conservation clubs organized around it. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted millions of seedlings as part of New Deal programs, and the Soil Conservation Service offered farmers approximately $8 per acre, the equivalent of roughly $170 today, to establish it on eroded hillsides. The pitch was elegant. Kudzu would halt soil erosion, feed livestock, and beautify degraded land. Nature received this pitch without enthusiasm. Kudzu is native to East Asia, where it is kept in check by a suite of insects, fungi, and grazing animals that co-evolved with it over thousands of years. Transplanted to the American Southeast, it encountered essentially no biological resistance and a climate almost perfectly suited to its growth habits. It can grow up to a foot per day in summer. It smothers entire tree canopies, blocking sunlight and collapsing them under its weight. It alters soil chemistry through nitrogen fixation in ways that favor its own growth and disadvantage native plants. Ecologists and botanists began raising concerns about kudzu's invasive potential by the late 1940s and early 1950s. The government's response was measured in decades. It wasn't removed from the list of permissible cover plants until 1953, and wasn't classified as a federal noxious weed until 1998. Nearly 50 years after the warning flags appeared. The plant now covers an estimated 2 to 7 million acres of the American South. It has been advancing northward as winters become milder. A 2011 study found that kudzu's expansion was also contributing to regional ozone pollution. The plant releases isoprene at high rates, which reacts with nitrogen oxides to form ground-level ozone, an entirely unforeseen second-order ecological consequence that nobody modeled before releasing millions of seedlings across 8 states. Current remediation efforts, herbicide application, mechanical removal, biological control research, cost an estimated $500 million annually and have produced limited results. Planting kudzu to fix erosion and then watching it devour the South is nature's version of using a flamethrower to deal with a candle problem. The original issue is gone. Everything else is also on fire. 5. In 1935, 102 cane toads were imported to Queensland, Australia, and deliberately released into sugarcane fields to control the cane beetle. Scientists called it a practical, elegant biological solution. The beetles were damaging crops. The toads would eat the beetles. Simple. Except nobody apparently verified in any meaningful way that the toads could actually reach the beetles, which lived high on sugarcane stalks, well above the reach of ground-dwelling toads. The toads had essentially no interest in the beetles. They had considerable interest in eating everything else within range, and in being catastrophically toxic to every native predator that attempted to eat them. Cane toads produce a powerful bufatoxin from glands on their shoulders that can kill dogs, snakes, freshwater crocodiles, and quolls within minutes of ingestion. Predators in the Americas evolved to avoid them. Australian predators had no such instinct and no such history. The results were swift and severe. The northern quoll population in affected areas collapsed by over 90%. Freshwater crocodile populations in some regions declined by 77%. Large monitor lizard species were locally devastated across wide areas. From the original 102 individuals, the cane toad population in Australia is now estimated at over 200 million. They have spread across most of Queensland, the Northern Territory, and are advancing into Western Australia and New South Wales at roughly 40 to 60 kilometers per year. Scientists and naturalists raised concerns before the 1935 release. The suggestion was modeled on a cane toad introduction in Puerto Rico, but the beetle species and ecological conditions were sufficiently different that the comparison was fundamentally flawed. Those concerns were overridden by agricultural and economic pressures. There is now a documented case of evolutionary counter-adaptation. Some snake populations in toad-affected areas have evolved smaller heads relative to body size over just a few decades, making it physically impossible for them to swallow an adult toad. That is real-time natural selection driven by a deliberate human decision. Australian researchers have been exploring biological controls for decades, including a naturally occurring virus, a parasitic lungworm, and genetic engineering strategies. None have produced a scalable solution. Releasing cane toads to solve a pest problem is exactly the kind of logic that makes sense in a boardroom and makes every ecologist in the building quietly pack their lunch and go home. 6. By 1926, wolves had been completely eliminated from Yellowstone National Park. The process was federally sanctioned and systematically executed by government hunters and trappers who operated under the confident assumption that removing predators protected prey animals and therefore produced a healthier, more abundant ecosystem. The science seemed straightforward. It was also exactly backwards. With wolves gone, elk populations lost their primary predator and expanded dramatically. But more importantly, elk behavior changed. Without fear of predation, they grazed intensively and in stationary patterns, particularly along riverbanks and valley bottoms, stripping willows, aspens, and cottonwoods down to bare ground. The loss of that riparian vegetation caused riverbanks to erode. Without root systems holding the soil, rivers widened and shallowed. Beaver populations collapsed because the willows they depended on for food and dam construction had disappeared. Without beaver dams, wetland habitats dried up, reducing water retention across the landscape. This cascade of consequences from removing a single predator is now the textbook definition of a trophic cascade, a phenomenon where eliminating a top predator reorganizes the entire food web and even the physical geography of a landscape. 41 wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995. Elk immediately began avoiding valley bottoms and riverbanks, not because wolves were always present, but because they could be. Ecologists call this the landscape of fear. That behavioral shift alone allowed vegetation to recover in areas that had been barren for decades. Within 2 decades of reintroduction, willows and aspens had recovered across many areas. Beavers returned, wetlands were restored, songbird populations increased, and river channels in some areas physically narrowed and deepened as bank vegetation stabilized the soil. The wolves, in effect, changed the physical shape of the rivers. It is worth noting that naturalist Aldo Leopold, who participated in wolf culls early in his career, later publicly recanted and became one of the most vocal advocates for predator conservation in American history. The lesson existed. People had to live inside the consequences of ignoring it before it was taken seriously. Killing wolves to protect deer is like firing the only engineer on a ship because the passengers find his hard hat annoying. Everything seems fine until the hull starts flooding and nobody left knows where the wrenches are. 7. When beekeepers across the United States began reporting in 2006 that they were losing 30 to 90% of their colonies, with worker bees simply vanishing and leaving behind a queen, intact honey stores, and essentially no bodies. The initial public and regulatory framing was that this was an agricultural sector inconvenience, a niche problem for a niche profession. That framing ignored something fundamental. Honeybees directly or indirectly support the pollination of approximately 1/3 of the human food supply. Colony collapse disorder was not a beekeeping story. It was a food supply warning that showed up wearing a beekeeper's veil. The defining characteristic of colony collapse disorder was the near-total disappearance of adult worker bees. The hive's entire labor force gone, with almost no dead bees present near the site. Research eventually identified not a single cause, but a compounding cluster. Varroa destructor mites that feed on bee fat bodies and transmit viruses. Neonicotinoid pesticides that impair bee navigation, immune function, and reproduction. Habitat loss, reducing forage diversity. Nutritional deficiencies from monoculture agriculture, and pathogen stress from nosema fungi. Neonicotinoids, a class of insecticide introduced in the 1990s and now among the world's most widely used agricultural chemicals, were shown in multiple peer-reviewed studies to impair the homing ability of bees, causing forager bees to become unable to navigate back to the hive. The European Union banned outdoor use of 3 key neonicotinoids in 2018. The United States regulatory response was significantly slower. The economic value of honeybee pollination to U.S. agriculture alone is estimated at $15 to $20 billion annually. Almonds, 95% of global production concentrated in California, are entirely dependent on managed honeybee pollination. Blueberries, cherries, and cucumbers face similar existential production risk if colony losses continue accelerating. Managed honeybee losses in the United States have averaged between 30 and 45% annually since colony collapse disorder was first reported, losses that beekeepers offset through intensive management and colony splitting, but at escalating cost. The system is surviving, but it is operating in a state of managed crisis. Treating honeybee collapse as a beekeeping industry problem is like noticing that all the engines on a commercial aircraft are on fire and filing it under maintenance instead of landing immediately. 8. For decades across Southeast Asia, coastal governments and international development agencies looked at dense, impenetrable mangrove forests lining the coastline and saw wasted economic potential. The logic was clean: clear the trees, build shrimp ponds, generate export revenue. Between 1980 and 2000, an estimated 35% of the world's mangrove forests disappeared, with shrimp aquaculture responsible for approximately 38% of that loss. Countries including Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Ecuador, and Bangladesh all experienced massive mangrove deforestation during export booms. What those countries were actually clearing was the following: nursery habitat for 80% of commercially important fish species in the tropics, coastal storm buffers capable of reducing tsunami wave heights, carbon sinks storing up to 5 times more carbon per hectare than tropical rainforests, and water filtration systems protecting the very coastal fisheries that local communities depended on before aquaculture arrived. The shrimp pond business model had a predictable failure cycle. Ponds were productive for 5 to 10 years, then accumulated disease from viral pathogens, including white spot syndrome virus, along with heavy metals and acidic sulfur compounds from disturbed peat soils. Producers would then abandon the degraded pond and clear more mangrove for a new one, essentially mining the coastline forward until the coastline ran out. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami produced a brutal natural experiment. Coastal communities protected by intact mangrove belts experienced dramatically lower casualty rates and less infrastructure destruction than adjacent communities where mangroves had been cleared for aquaculture. Satellite analysis after the disaster confirmed the protective correlation across multiple countries. Local artisanal fishers who had provided protein for their communities through wild catch for generations found their fisheries collapsing in parallel with the mangroves, because the juvenile fish that sustained those fisheries had been raised in the forests that were now shrimp ponds. Restoration is extraordinarily slow. Mangrove ecosystems take 20 to 50 years to approach full ecological function, and soil chemistry in abandoned shrimp ponds is often so altered that natural recolonization fails without intensive intervention. Clearing mangroves for shrimp ponds is the coastal equivalent of selling the structural beams of your house for scrap metal and then being astonished when the walls collapse during the next storm. 9. By the late 1960s, Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes, part of a freshwater system containing roughly 20% of the world's surface freshwater, was producing algae blooms so massive they were visible from space, catching fire at its river tributaries and being pronounced ecologically dead by the press. The Cuyahoga River, flowing into the lake through Cleveland, caught fire multiple times in the 20th century. The 1969 fire, while not the largest of those events, became nationally symbolic and helped catalyze the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. The crisis was driven primarily by phosphorus loading from agricultural runoff, municipal sewage discharge, and industrial effluent. Phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in most freshwater systems, and excess phosphorus triggers explosive algae growth that depletes oxygen, blocks sunlight, and produces toxins lethal to fish and aquatic life. Following the Clean Water Act and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, signed between the United States and Canada in 1972, phosphorus inputs were substantially reduced through sewage treatment upgrades and phosphate detergent bans. The lake's ecology improved dramatically through the 1980s. The recovery was declared a success, and then largely forgotten as an ongoing obligation. Agricultural phosphorus inputs were never fully controlled, and climate change began warming the lake's surface temperatures, extending the stratification season, and creating more favorable conditions for cyanobacteria. By the early 2000s, toxic algae blooms had returned. In 2014, a bloom contaminated the Toledo, Ohio municipal water supply with microcystin toxins, leaving 400,000 people without safe tap water for 3 days. The first major American city water crisis, caused by algal toxins. The western basin of Lake Erie now experiences toxic bloom conditions regularly, with blooms in some years extending to over 700 square miles. Agricultural phosphorus runoff, primarily from dissolved reactive phosphorus in tile drainage from corn and soybean fields, remains the dominant current driver, and regulatory frameworks for agricultural non-point source pollution remain significantly weaker than for industrial or municipal sources. Celebrating Lake Erie's recovery in 1985 and then stopping all protective effort is like a patient leaving intensive care, lighting a cigarette in the parking lot, and being shocked when they're back in the cardiac unit by Tuesday. 10. The timber industry spent most of the 20th century successfully promoting a single, elegant argument to government agencies and the public. Trees grow back. Forests are renewable. Logging is farming. There is no meaningful difference between an ancient forest and a plantation of uniform trees planted to replace it. This was not a scientific claim. It was a business model dressed as ecology. An old-growth forest is not a collection of old trees. It is a complex, co-evolved ecological community that took centuries to construct and cannot be rebuilt on any human timescale. Old-growth forests are characterized by multiple canopy layers, abundant standing dead trees, called snags, that serve as nesting and foraging habitat for dozens of specialist species. Large fallen logs in various stages of decomposition that support invertebrate communities, diverse understory plants, and deep fungal networks connecting tree root systems. This structure takes a minimum of 200 to 500 years to develop, and it supports species that literally cannot survive in younger or managed forests. Approximately 96% of the old-growth forest that once covered the continental United States has been logged. The Pacific Northwest, which once held the world's largest temperate rainforest, saw roughly 80 to 90% of its ancient forest removed in the 20th century. The northern spotted owl, listing as a threatened species in 1990, forced a legal confrontation between the industry's renewable resource narrative and ecological science. The owl required old-growth forest specifically because it nested in large snags and depended on old-growth prey communities. No amount of plantation forestry could substitute for that structural complexity. The mycorrhizal networks connecting trees in old-growth forests, sometimes called the wood wide web, facilitate nutrient and water transfer between trees, support seedling establishment, and represent biological infrastructure that is permanently severed by clear-cutting and does not reconstitute in plantation monocultures. A 2020 study found that the world's remaining old-growth forests store significantly more carbon per hectare than any managed forest system, making them irreplaceable from a climate standpoint as well as a biodiversity standpoint. Calling plantation forestry a replacement for old growth is like demolishing the Sistine Chapel and saying you've preserved art because you put a poster of it up in the parking lot. 11. When DDT was introduced as an agricultural and public health pesticide in the 1940s, it was celebrated as a miracle of modern chemistry. Promotional films showed children being doused in DDT spray at public events. Crops were drenched. It was presented as essentially harmless to mammals and humans, a targeted insect killer with no ecological downside. The confidence was based on the fact that DDT was chemically stable and appeared not to affect mammals at ground-level doses. What nobody had worked through was what happens when a chemically stable compound accumulates through the food chain. The process is called biomagnification. Concentrations increase at each step up the food web. In heavily sprayed environments, plankton might carry microscopic traces of DDT. Small fish eating the plankton accumulate more, large fish accumulate more still. Fish-eating birds at the top of the chain could accumulate concentrations millions of times higher than environmental levels. DDT's most visible ecological consequence was on bird reproduction. It interfered with calcium metabolism, causing birds to produce eggs with shells so thin they cracked under the weight of incubating parents. Bald eagle populations in the continental United States had collapsed to approximately 417 breeding pairs by 1963, down from an estimated 100,000 in the pre-colonial period. The peregrine falcon was in freefall. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service researchers circulated internal reports on DDT's wildlife impacts years before public attention arrived. Those reports were effectively buried under political and industry pressure. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, synthesized the evidence and presented it to a general audience. The chemical industry immediately attacked Carson personally and professionally. The book nonetheless catalyzed a public reckoning that led to the United States banning DDT for agricultural use in 1972. Following the ban, bald eagle populations recovered from 417 pairs to over 9,800 pairs by 2006, when they were removed from the endangered species list. DDT and its breakdown products remain detectable in human blood and fatty tissue globally today, including in populations in regions where DDT was never heavily used, and in Antarctic penguins, Arctic polar bears, and deep ocean sediments. Spraying DDT on children because the label said it was safe is a reminder that tested and approved and harmless are two sentences that nature refuses to treat as synonyms. 12. As recently as the 19th century, the dominant scientific and public consensus held that ocean fish populations were essentially inexhaustible. Thomas Huxley, one of the most celebrated biologists of the Victorian era, declared in 1883 that the great sea fisheries were inexhaustible. He was wrong in a way that would take another century to fully demonstrate, but the machinery of that demonstration was already being assembled. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland had supported one of the world's most productive fisheries for roughly 500 years. Early European explorers described waters so full of cod that ships could barely sail through them. Following the introduction of industrial bottom trawlers in the mid-20th century, cod stocks collapsed so completely that Canada declared a moratorium on cod fishing in 1992. That moratorium, initially declared for 2 years, has never meaningfully ended. The cod population has not substantially recovered over 30 years later. The collapse eliminated approximately 40,000 direct jobs in the Canadian fishing industry overnight and devastated economies of coastal Newfoundland communities that had existed in relation to that fishery for generations. Current estimates from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization indicate that approximately 34% of the world's fish stocks are overfished, fished beyond sustainable yield, and an additional 60% are fished at maximum sustainable yield. Fewer than 10% of global fish stocks have remaining capacity for increased harvest. Industrial bottom trawling physically destroys the complex seafloor habitats that juvenile fish and countless other marine species depend on. It has been described by marine biologists as the oceanic equivalent of clear-cutting forests, with the additional inconvenience of being largely invisible to the public. Bycatch, non-target species caught unintentionally, is estimated at 40% of total global marine catch, including sea turtles, dolphins, juvenile fish of all species, and seabirds, discarded with no economic benefit. Fisheries science developed the concept of maximum sustainable yield in the 1950s as a management framework. It was consistently undermined by political pressure to set quotas above scientific recommendations. Declaring the ocean's fish inexhaustible because you couldn't see the bottom is the aquatic equivalent of assuming your bank account is infinite because you haven't bothered to log in and check. 13. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, acclimatization societies across the British Empire, Australia, New Zealand, and North America made it their explicit mission to improve local fauna by introducing species from Europe and elsewhere. It was considered enlightened, scientifically progressive, and even patriotic to take an animal from one continent and release it into another. The Acclimatization Society of Victoria in Australia was formally established in 1861 with the stated goal of introducing useful and ornamental species to Australian environments. It successfully introduced sparrows, starlings, rabbits, foxes, and dozens of other species, essentially constructing the invasive species catastrophe that Australian conservation has been fighting ever since. European rabbits were introduced to Australia in 1859 when a settler released 24 wild rabbits on his property for hunting. Within decades, millions of rabbits were stripping vegetation across vast areas of the interior, causing severe soil erosion and directly competing with native marsupials for food. Australia's rabbit population today is estimated at several hundred million. Starlings were introduced to North America in 1890 when a Shakespeare enthusiast released 60 European starlings in Central Park with the stated goal of introducing every bird species mentioned in Shakespeare's works to America. That population has grown to an estimated 200 million starlings across North America, outcompeting native cavity nesting birds for nest sites and causing an estimated $800 million in agricultural damage annually. The mongoose was introduced to Hawaii in 1883 to control rats in sugarcane fields. Nobody apparently verified beforehand that rats are nocturnal and mongooses are diurnal. The mongooses instead devastated ground-nesting native bird populations, contributing to the extinction of multiple Hawaiian bird species. Brown tree snakes accidentally introduced to Guam after World War II eliminated 9 of Guam's 12 native forest bird species. Invasive species are currently the second leading cause of global biodiversity loss after habitat destruction, costing an estimated $423 billion globally per year, a figure that has increased fourfold per decade since 1970. Ecologists warned about introduction risks throughout this period. Their voices were not included in decision-making structures run by wealthy gentlemen naturalists, motivated by sentiment and Victorian notions of improvement. The Acclimatization Society approach to ecology was essentially adding random ingredients to a recipe that had been feeding an entire continent for 50 million years, because the original chef's choices seemed insufficiently European. 14. For most of recorded Western history, wetlands were swamps, foul, pestilent, economically unproductive, and dangerous. Draining them was synonymous with progress. Every major Western civilization that encountered them drained them as fast as technology allowed. The United States alone passed the Swampland Acts of 1849, 1850, and 1860, which transferred millions of acres of federal wetlands to states specifically for the purpose of draining and reclaiming them for agriculture. The country has since lost an estimated 53% of its original wetland area, roughly 110 million acres. What those wetlands were actually doing, while nobody was paying attention: providing water filtration, absorbing floodwater, storing carbon, supporting fisheries, and hosting an extraordinary concentration of the continent's biodiversity. Wetlands are estimated to provide $47 trillion in annual ecosystem services globally. Because those services were never priced into markets, they were systematically treated as having zero value, which is one of the more expensive accounting errors in human history. Coastal and inland wetlands function as natural flood buffers. Studies following Hurricane Katrina found that coastal marshland loss in Louisiana directly amplified storm surge damage, with each mile of wetland loss increasing surge height by approximately 1 foot. Peatlands, a type of wetland, cover only about 3% of Earth's land surface, but store approximately twice as much carbon as all the world's forests combined. Draining them converts carbon sinks to carbon sources, China drained extensive portions of its Yangtze River floodplain wetlands during the 20th century to convert them to agriculture. The catastrophic 1998 Yangtze floods, which killed over 3,000 people and caused $30 billion in damage, were explicitly linked by Chinese scientists to upstream and floodplain wetland destruction. The government reversed course and began restoration programs. Despite growing scientific understanding of their value, global wetland loss continues at approximately 35% faster than forest loss. Between 1970 and 2015, an estimated 35% of the world's remaining wetlands disappeared. Draining wetlands because they look unproductive is like tearing out all the plumbing, insulation, and electrical wiring from a house because it's just stuff in the walls, and then wondering why the house costs a fortune to heat and keeps flooding. 15. The Green Revolution of the mid-20th century was treated as one of humanity's greatest achievements. High-yield crop varieties, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and massive single-crop farms producing more food per acre than anyone had thought possible. Nature's inefficient, messy biodiversity was being rationalized into clean rows of maximum output. Monoculture farming traded long-term ecological resilience for short-term yield, creating agricultural systems exquisitely vulnerable to disease, pests, soil degradation, and climate variability. Warning signs that appeared almost immediately and were consistently optimized around rather than addressed. The Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1852 is the canonical warning about monoculture vulnerability that nobody incorporated into 20th century agricultural planning. Ireland's dependence on a single potato variety meant that a single pathogen could trigger catastrophic famine. Approximately 1 million people died, and another million immigrated. The lesson was available. It was not applied. The Cavendish banana, the one sold in essentially every supermarket on Earth, is a monoculture that replaced the Gros Michel variety, which was commercially wiped out by Panama disease in the mid-20th century. The Cavendish is now threatened by Tropical Race 4, a new strain of the same fungal pathogen, which has spread across Asia, Australia, Africa, and Latin America. Because the Cavendish is reproduced entirely through clonal cuttings, every plant is genetically identical and equally vulnerable. Industrial monoculture's reliance on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers has fundamentally altered the global nitrogen cycle, with excess nitrogen from agricultural runoff creating hypoxic dead zones in coastal waters, including a zone in the Gulf of Mexico that regularly exceeds 8,000 square miles. Topsoil loss under continuous monoculture farming averages 10 to 100 times the rate of soil formation. The United States loses approximately 1.7 billion tons of topsoil annually. Pesticide use in monocultures has driven significant insect population declines, with the biomass of flying insects in German nature reserves declining by over 75% between 1989 and 2016. The FAO estimates that 75% of plant genetic diversity was lost in the 20th century as farmers moved to uniform high-yield varieties. Building a global food system on monocultures is the agricultural equivalent of constructing a civilization on one load-bearing wall and being genuinely surprised when a single crack brings everything down. 16. The scientific connection between atmospheric carbon dioxide and planetary temperature is not a recent discovery invented by environmental activists in the 1990s. The basic physics were established in the 19th century. The first measurements showing rising atmospheric carbon dioxide were taken in 1958. The first formal United States government warning reached the president's desk in 1965. None of this produced meaningful urgency. Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius calculated in 1896 that doubling atmospheric carbon dioxide would raise global temperatures by approximately 5 degrees Celsius, a figure remarkably close to modern climate sensitivity estimates. He published this in a major scientific journal. It was noted, discussed briefly in academic circles, and largely forgotten. Charles David Keeling began continuous atmospheric carbon dioxide measurements at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii in 1958. Within a few years, the data showed a clear, consistent annual rise. The resulting Keeling curve became the most famous graph in climate science and was available to policymakers from the early 1960s. A 1965 report to President Lyndon Johnson from his Science Advisory Committee explicitly warned that burning fossil fuels was increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide and would cause measurable warming with significant consequences. This was a formal government document. Internal documents later released through investigative journalism showed that Exxon's own scientists were producing accurate climate projections by the early 1980s that matched what independent academic researchers were finding. The company subsequently funded climate denial campaigns, lobbied against climate legislation, and publicly disputed the science its own researchers had confirmed. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established in 1988 and issued its first comprehensive assessment in 1990 with a clear scientific consensus that human-caused warming was occurring and posed serious risks. In the 32 years since, annual global greenhouse gas emissions have continued rising in most years. Global mean temperature has already risen approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The physical consequences, accelerating ice melt, sea level rise, intensifying extreme weather events, are no longer projections. Being warned about rising carbon dioxide in 1896, 1958, 1965, and 1988, and continuing to build the fossil fuel economy is like a doctor telling you your arteries are hardening at every annual checkup for 40 years, and your only consistent response being to order a larger steak. 17. Coal companies in the Appalachian Mountains developed mountaintop removal mining, a process of literally blasting the tops off mountains to access coal seams. And their public relations apparatus described it using terms like surface mining, land reclamation, and economic development. The regulatory framework treated it as a land use decision. It is not a land use decision. It is the permanent elimination of a mountain and everything on it. The rubble, called valley fill, is pushed into adjacent streams and valleys, burying hundreds of miles of headwater streams under millions of tons of debris. Mountaintop removal has affected over 500 mountains in the Appalachian region, primarily in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. An estimated 1.2 million acres have been disturbed or destroyed since the 1970s. Valley fills have buried an estimated 2,000 miles of Appalachian headwater streams. The small streams that are the biological foundation of the entire Appalachian watershed, serving as spawning and nursery habitat for fish, invertebrates, and amphibians that support fisheries throughout the broader ecosystem. Aquatic invertebrate communities are eliminated in streams affected by valley fills. Studies comparing stream health above and below fills consistently show near total loss of sensitive species. Since macroinvertebrates are a primary food source for fish and a key ecological health indicator, their loss cascades throughout the food web. Water quality impacts extend well beyond physical burial. Blasting releases selenium, sulfates, and heavy metals into waterways, and elevated conductivity in affected streams has been linked to the near total elimination of native fish and invertebrate species, effects that persist decades after mining operations cease. Required reclamation typically produces flat grasslands where diverse Appalachian hardwood forest, one of the most biologically diverse temperate forest systems on Earth, once stood. Public health studies in communities adjacent to mountaintop removal operations have found elevated rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and birth defects compared to non-mining communities. Environmental engineers and hydrologists raised concerns about valley fill impacts throughout the 1970s as the practice was being developed. Regulatory agencies consistently approved permits over scientific objections. Calling mountaintop removal land management is like describing a demolition crew as interior decorators, because they technically did change the appearance of the building. 18, for most of human intellectual history, and well into the 20th century, the dominant framework for thinking about ecosystems was the balance of nature. The idea held that ecosystems were naturally self-regulating, stable systems that would always correct back to equilibrium if left alone. It was elegant and reassuring, and it was also, ecologists eventually demonstrated, built on a philosophical foundation rather than a scientific one. The concept dates to ancient Greek philosophy and was formalized in 18th century natural theology. It was not a hypothesis derived from field observations. It was a theological proposition dressed in naturalist language. Nature tends toward order. Disruptions self-correct. The system is fundamentally stable. The scientific discipline of ecology began producing evidence through the mid-20th century that ecosystems were not static equilibria, but dynamic systems with multiple possible stable states. This work was largely invisible to policymakers, who continued operating under the balance of nature assumption because it was convenient. The concept of alternative stable states, the framework showing that ecosystems can shift between fundamentally different conditions and resist returning to the original state, was formally developed in ecological literature beginning in the 1970s. It explains phenomena like the transformation of a clear lake into a turbid, algae-dominated system after phosphorus loading, or the shift of a coral reef to an algae-covered rubble field after bleaching. The balance of nature assumption directly enabled the systematic overexploitation of resources because it implied nature would recover. Fisheries managers, logging planners, and wildlife agencies consistently underestimated the risk of pushing systems past tipping points, assuming recovery would follow any reduction in pressure. Regime shifts, sudden dramatic changes in ecosystem state that are difficult or impossible to reverse, have been documented in coral reefs, lakes, forests, and grasslands globally. They typically occur when a system is already stressed by multiple pressures and a triggering event pushes it past a threshold. At that point, feedback mechanisms that previously maintained the original state begin maintaining the new, degraded state instead. Ecologists now operate within the framework of planetary boundaries, which identifies 9 Earth system processes that must remain within limits to maintain stable conditions. Current assessments suggest at least 6 of those 9 boundaries have been breached. Believing the balance of nature will absorb anything we throw at it is like believing a bridge can hold unlimited weight because it has been standing for 100 years. The physics don't care about the bridge's track record. 19, for centuries across Europe and increasingly across Southeast Asia from the late 20th century onward, peat bogs were viewed as wasteland, waterlogged, useless, malarial, and agriculturally barren. Draining them was synonymous with improvement. Britain alone drained approximately 94% of its lowland peat bogs during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Southeast Asian peatland forests were burned and drained for palm oil plantations beginning in the 1980s. What was actually being drained was one of the most carbon-dense ecosystems on the planet. Peatlands cover approximately 3% of Earth's land surface, but store an estimated 550 gigatons of carbon, roughly twice the carbon stored in all the world's forests combined, and equivalent to approximately 75 years of current global carbon dioxide emissions. That carbon is stored in waterlogged, oxygen-poor conditions where organic matter accumulates without decomposing. When peatlands are drained, oxygen penetrates the previously anoxic soil, microbial decomposition accelerates, and the stored organic carbon oxidizes and releases as carbon dioxide. A drained peatland that took 10,000 years to accumulate its carbon can begin releasing it within years. Indonesia and Malaysia contain some of the world's largest tropical peatland systems. Massive drainage and burning for palm oil plantations from the 1980s onward has made Indonesia one of the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters in severe fire years. The 2015 Indonesian peat fires released an estimated 1.75 billion tons of carbon dioxide in a single season, exceeding Germany's total annual emissions. Peat fires burn underground, smoldering through the drained organic substrate. The 2015 fires burned for months despite intervention efforts. Smoke from those fires caused an estimated 100,000 premature deaths from respiratory disease across Southeast Asia. British lowland peat bogs, drained over centuries for agriculture, now release more carbon dioxide annually than the entire UK aviation industry. Restoration involves raising water tables through blocking drainage channels, but is slow, expensive, and uncertain. The Flow Country in northern Scotland, one of Europe's largest remaining blanket bog systems, was extensively planted with commercial forestry in the 1980s under government tax incentives, draining the peat and releasing carbon before the policy was eventually reversed. Draining a peat bog to farm it is like withdrawing your entire retirement savings, accumulated over 10,000 years, spending it on something that breaks in 5 years, and only then reading the account statement. 20. For the last several decades, coastal development has proceeded at extraordinary pace in low-lying areas globally, driven by the assumption that sea level rise was a gradual, manageable, distant future problem. Insurance companies priced it that way. Zoning boards planned around it. Entire cities doubled down on coastal real estate investment, while sea level data accumulated in plain sight. Global mean sea level has risen approximately 20 centimeters since 1900, with the rate accelerating. Current measurements show seas rising at approximately 3.7 millimeters per year, roughly twice the 20th century average. Miami Beach, Florida, has spent over $500 million on infrastructure to manage chronic tidal flooding, flooding that occurs during high tides without any storm or rainfall. Tidal flooding days in Miami have increased from a handful per year in 1960 to over 20 per year currently. Projections suggest it will become a near-daily occurrence by mid-century. The city is built on porous limestone that cannot be sealed against groundwater intrusion, making conventional seawall solutions fundamentally ineffective at the structural level. The Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Maldives, low-lying Pacific and Indian Ocean island nations, face existential threats from rising seas. Multiple atoll communities have already been relocated. The Maldives government held an underwater cabinet meeting in 2009 to dramatize the threat. Flood insurance in the United States has been heavily subsidized through the National Flood Insurance Program, which has consistently underpriced flood risk in low-lying areas. This subsidization directly incentivized development in areas that private insurance markets recognize as uninsurable at market rates. The program has been deeply in debt since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Jakarta, Indonesia is sinking at rates of up to 25 centimeters per year in some districts due to groundwater pumping. Parts of the city are already below sea level. The Indonesian government has been planning to relocate the national capital in response. The Greenland ice sheet is losing an estimated 280 billion tons of ice per year. A 2020 study found that coastal properties facing significant flood risk in the United States were overvalued by approximately $237 billion relative to their actuarially fair risk-adjusted value. Building luxury coastal real estate while ignoring sea level rise data is the financial equivalent of buying a beach house. Having a hydrologist explain exactly when it will be underwater, and then refinishing the kitchen. 21. The practice of setting fire to tropical forests, to clear land for cattle ranching, soy cultivation, and palm oil expansion has been relentlessly framed in developmental language. Land clearing, agricultural expansion, rural progress. The language implies that what comes after is more valuable than what was there. What was there was the Amazon rainforest, a system containing an estimated 150 to 200 billion tons of carbon, generating its own regional rainfall through a process scientists call flying rivers, and housing an estimated 50% of all terrestrial species on approximately 7% of Earth's land surface. The Amazon is sometimes called the lungs of the Earth, though the more precise framing is that it is a massive carbon store and a regional climate regulator of extraordinary importance. The flying rivers process works like this. Transpiration from forest trees releases enormous quantities of water vapor that moves as aerial moisture flows across the continent, feeding rainfall in areas far from the forest itself. Studies suggest that large-scale deforestation in the Amazon could reduce rainfall in the interior of South America by 20 to 30%, with direct consequences for agriculture in Brazil's major farming regions. Deforestation to create agricultural land may ultimately destroy the rainfall that makes the region's agriculture possible. Scientists have identified a potential tipping point. If deforestation exceeds approximately 20 to 25% of the original forest cover, reduced moisture recycling may push the eastern Amazon into a self-sustaining drying process that prevents forest regeneration, a transition from rainforest to dry savanna that would be effectively irreversible. Current deforestation is estimated at 17 to 20% of the original Amazon extent. Tropical deforestation contributes an estimated 10 to 15% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions, comparable to the entire transportation sector. Ecosystem service valuations of standing tropical forest consistently exceed the economic value of the agriculture that replaces it, representing a massive and ongoing market failure. The Congo Basin and Southeast Asian tropical forests face similar pressures. Burning tropical forests to plant soybeans is the ecological equivalent of melting down your house's electrical wiring to sell the copper, and then wondering why everything goes dark and the appliances stop working. 22. In the early 19th century, the passenger pigeon was almost certainly the most numerous bird species in human history. Flocks darkened the sky for days as they passed. John James Audubon described a flock in 1813 that he estimated darkened the sky for 3 consecutive days. The species' total population has been estimated at 3 to 5 billion individuals, representing an estimated 25 to 40% of the total bird population of North America. The idea that such a species could be hunted to extinction was widely considered absurd. The last passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo on September 1st, 1914. The species went from billions to 0 in approximately 50 years. Commercial hunting of passenger pigeons was industrialized following the expansion of the telegraph and railroad network, which allowed hunters to track flock movements and ship birds to urban markets with speed that had never previously been possible. Professional hunting operations harvested millions of birds at single nesting sites. Documented kills of over 50,000 birds per day at large nesting colonies were recorded. The birds' colonial nesting behavior, which made them spectacularly productive as a species, also made them catastrophically vulnerable. Their nesting colonies were enormous, easily located, and the presence of a colony attracted hunters from across the region. Disruption of nesting colonies reduced reproductive success and accelerated the population collapse. By the 1870s, naturalists and ornithologists were publicly warning that commercial hunting was driving severe population decline. Several states enacted protective legislation in the 1880s, but enforcement was essentially non-existent, and commercial hunting interests lobbied successfully against stronger protections. The last large nesting colony was recorded in Michigan in 1878. By the 1890s, the species had become rare. The last confirmed wild individual was shot in Ohio in 1900. Modern genetic analysis of passenger pigeon specimens has revealed that the species maintained extraordinarily high genetic diversity despite its massive numbers, contradicting any hypothesis that the population had been in decline before European contact. The extinction was not inevitable. It was chosen repeatedly in the face of explicit warnings. Hunting the passenger pigeon to extinction while dismissing warnings because there were billions of them is like draining a reservoir labeled inexhaustible and then being confused by the drought. 23, when synthetic pesticides were introduced to agriculture in the mid-20th century, the expectation was that they would solve the insect pest problem permanently. Apply the chemical, eliminate the pest, move on. It was a technological victory over biology, or so the framing went. Biologists predicted resistance from evolutionary first principles almost immediately because the mechanism is not complicated. In any large pest population, random genetic variation means some individuals are slightly better able to survive exposure to a pesticide. Those individuals survive, reproduce, and pass on their resistance genes. Under sustained selection pressure, the resistant genotype rapidly becomes dominant. The pesticide eliminates the susceptible competition and leaves a population of survivors that are immune to it. The first documented case of insecticide resistance was recorded in 1908 in scale insects resistant to sulfur compounds. By 1914, resistance had been documented in multiple agricultural pests. When DDT was introduced in the 1940s, resistance in houseflies was observed within 6 years of widespread use. As of current data, over 600 insect and mite species have evolved resistance to at least one pesticide. Many are resistant to multiple chemical classes. Some populations of the diamondback moth and the brown planthopper are resistant to essentially all available chemical controls. The agricultural response to resistance has primarily been to increase application rates, which accelerates resistance evolution, and switch to new chemical classes, which initiates new resistance cycles. This approach has been described by evolutionary biologists as evolutionary suicide, maximizing selection pressure for resistance without addressing the underlying dynamic. Herbicide resistance follows the same pattern. Glyphosate was widely adopted from the 1990s onward. Over 250 weed species have now evolved glyphosate resistance globally, with resistant populations present in 40 countries. Integrated pest management, using combinations of biological controls, crop rotation, physical barriers, and targeted chemical use, was developed and promoted by agricultural scientists beginning in the 1960s. It has been consistently underadopted because its benefits are long-term, while its costs are immediate, which is a recurring theme in the relationship between ecology and economics. Responding to pesticide resistance by applying more pesticide is the agricultural equivalent of trying to douse a fire with gasoline, noting it didn't work, and asking the chemical company to produce a slightly different formulation of gasoline. 24, beneath large portions of the American Great Plains, lies the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the world's largest underground freshwater reserves, accumulated over millions of years. When it was tapped for irrigation in the mid-20th century, the water seemed essentially limitless. Farmers drilled wells, irrigated crops, and built an agricultural economy on the assumption that the supply would always be there. The Ogallala refills at approximately half an inch per year. It is being drawn down at rates 10 to 100 times that recharge rate in heavily pumped areas. The aquifer underlies approximately 174,000 square miles of the Great Plains, covering parts of 8 states, and supports roughly 30% of all United States groundwater irrigated agriculture. In the heavily pumped southern portions, particularly in Texas and Kansas, water levels have declined by 100 feet or more since large-scale pumping began in the 1950s. Some parts of the Texas Panhandle have already exhausted economically accessible water. Farmers there have transitioned from irrigated to dryland agriculture, with dramatically reduced yields. The aquifer's recharge rate is negligible on human timescales because it was primarily charged during ancient periods of wetter climate. Current pumping represents fossil water extraction that is effectively non-renewable. Hydrologists and agricultural scientists began formally warning about Ogallala depletion in the 1960s and 70s. The 1982 High Plains Study, conducted by the United States Bureau of Reclamation, explicitly projected significant aquifer decline and its agricultural consequences. The political and economic response was to invest in more efficient irrigation technology, which extended the timeline of depletion but did not prevent it, while continuing to expand irrigated acreage. Similar groundwater depletion crises exist globally. The North China Plain aquifer, underlying China's primary wheat and corn-producing region, is being depleted at alarming rates. India's groundwater depletion has accelerated dramatically with the expansion of electric pump irrigation, particularly in Punjab. In California's Central Valley, extensive groundwater pumping for agriculture has caused some areas to sink by up to 28 feet since the 1920s, damaging infrastructure and reducing canal capacity in ways that are largely irreversible. Mining fossil groundwater at 10 times the recharge rate while ignoring the math is the hydrological equivalent of spending your retirement savings at 10 times your income rate and dismissing the concern because the balance still looks large in absolute terms. 25. The industrial livestock industry discovered in the 1950s that feeding low-dose antibiotics to healthy animals promoted faster growth and allowed animals to be raised in more crowded, less sanitary conditions with fewer disease outbreaks. It became standard practice globally. When health authorities raised concerns, the agricultural industry framed them as anti-farming activism. Agricultural use of antibiotics globally accounts for approximately 70 to 80% of total antibiotic consumption by weight. The majority of this use is not to treat sick animals, but to promote growth and prevent disease in crowded conditions, a practice called subtherapeutic use. The United States only formally restricted subtherapeutic use for growth promotion in 2017, decades after the practice was identified as a resistance risk. The mechanism is straightforward. Low-dose, prolonged antibiotic exposure is precisely the condition most likely to generate resistant bacteria. Doses high enough to kill susceptible strains, low enough for resistant variants to survive, over timescales long enough for resistance to spread through the population. Multiple studies have documented the transfer of resistant bacteria and resistance genes from livestock operations to surrounding environments, nearby waterways, farm workers, and community members. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, strains specifically associated with livestock, have spread into human hospital settings. The WHO has classified antibiotic resistance as one of the top 10 global public health threats. Antimicrobial resistant infections currently cause approximately 700,000 deaths per year globally. Conservative projections suggest this could rise to 10 million per year by 2050, exceeding cancer as a cause of death. Medical researchers and public health authorities began formally warning about the risks of agricultural antibiotic use in the 1960s. A 1969 UK government committee report recommended restricting agricultural antibiotic use to classes not used in human medicine. The recommendation was implemented partially in the United Kingdom, but largely ignored in the United States and many other countries for decades. Denmark banned agricultural growth promoter antibiotics in 1999 and saw no significant loss in agricultural productivity while substantially reducing antibiotic use. The alternative worked. Running 80% of the world's antibiotics through livestock operations for growth efficiency is the public health equivalent of removing the fire suppression system from every building in the city to slightly reduce the water bill. 26. When scientists F. Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina published their 1974 paper demonstrating that chlorofluorocarbons, the chemicals used in refrigerators, air conditioners, and aerosol sprays, were destroying the stratospheric ozone layer, the chemical industry did not accept the finding. They attacked it. They funded counter-research, questioned the scientists' credentials, and lobbied against regulation. This was not a minor industry concern. The ozone layer absorbs 97 to 99% of the sun's medium frequency ultraviolet radiation. Without it, ultraviolet B exposure at the surface increases to levels that dramatically elevate skin cancer rates, damage agricultural crops, and harm marine phytoplankton, the base of the ocean food chain. CFCs were widely considered safe because they were chemically inert at ground level. Rowland and Molina's finding was that this inertness allowed them to survive long enough to drift into the stratosphere, where ultraviolet radiation broke them apart, releasing chlorine atoms that catalytically destroyed ozone molecules. A single chlorine atom can destroy 100,000 ozone molecules before being deactivated. The Antarctic ozone hole was discovered in observational data by British Antarctic Survey scientists in 1985. It had been forming since the late 1970s, but had been missed because automated data systems were programmed to flag anomalous readings as instrument errors, effectively hiding the ozone loss in recorded data for years. The Montreal Protocol, negotiated in 1987, is now widely considered the most successful international environmental agreement in history. It has been ratified by 197 countries and has phased out the production of over 99% of ozone-depleting substances. DuPont, the primary manufacturer of CFCs, initially led industry opposition, but reversed its position after developing a viable alternative chemical that could be commercially patented. The existence of a profitable alternative fundamentally changed the political calculation. Rowland and Molina received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1995. By that time, their work had proven correct in every predicted detail. If CFC emissions had continued at 1987 levels, models project that by the 2060s, the global ozone layer would have declined by 67%. Effectively eliminating most ultraviolet protection over the mid-latitudes. The ozone story is the exception that proves the rule. When the replacement product was profitable, the industry moved. The chemical industry's response to ozone warnings was a script that has since been performed repeatedly, with fewer happy endings. 27. Soil is treated conceptually and economically as an inert growing medium. Dirt. You add fertilizer, it produces crops. If yields decline, add more fertilizer. The idea that soil is a living system that can be structurally and biologically degraded beyond recovery on manageable timescales is not part of mainstream agricultural economics, and it should be because the numbers are not abstract. Healthy agricultural topsoil contains an estimated 100 million to 1 billion bacterial cells per gram, several kilometers of fungal hyphae per gram, and thousands of invertebrate individuals per square meter. These organisms drive nutrient cycling, organic matter decomposition, water infiltration, and disease suppression, functions that synthetic inputs can partially, but never fully replace. The FAO estimates that 33% of the world's soil resources are currently degraded, with the primary drivers being erosion, compaction, salinization, acidification, and biological degradation, from tillage, chemical inputs, and monoculture. A 2015 FAO report warned that at current rates of degradation, the world has roughly 60 years of topsoil left in many agricultural regions. That is within most people's planning horizon, which makes the absence of policy urgency genuinely hard to explain. Soil erosion rates on conventionally farmed land average 10 to 100 times the rate of soil formation. The United States loses approximately 1.7 billion tons of topsoil annually. Globally, erosion is removing soil from agricultural land roughly 10 to 40 times faster than it can be replaced. Salinization, the accumulation of salt in soil from irrigation water evaporation, has rendered approximately 20% of the world's irrigated agricultural land unproductive. It destroyed the agricultural productivity of Mesopotamia and contributed to the decline of Sumerian civilization. Modern irrigation continues the same process at global scale. Soil compaction from heavy agricultural machinery reduces water infiltration and disrupts soil structure. Modern combine harvesters, weighing over 30 tons, generate compaction pressures that exceed the structural strength of many soil types, driving compaction to depths that conventional tillage cannot reach. Regenerative agriculture practices, no-till farming, cover cropping, diverse rotations, reduced chemical inputs, can build soil organic matter and restore biological function. Adoption rates remain low because transition costs are immediate and benefits are long-term. Treating soil like a passive substrate while running down its biological capital is exactly like treating your lungs as a filtering device whose condition doesn't matter as long as you can still sort of breathe. 28. The phrase mass extinction conjures asteroid impacts and volcanic winters. Geological catastrophes so large they register in the rock record for millions of years. Applying that term to the current moment, driven not by a single cataclysmic event, but by agriculture, development, and pollution, seemed melodramatic to many observers. Scientists who used it were regularly accused of environmentalist hyperbole. The Earth has experienced 5 mass extinctions in its history, defined as the loss of 75% or more of species in a geologically short period. The End Permian event, approximately 252 million years ago, killed roughly 96% of marine species, the most severe in the geological record. Current extinction rates are estimated at 100 to 1,000 times the background rate observed in the fossil record. This is a measurement, not a metaphor. A 2017 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences documented not just species extinction, but biological annihilation. The dramatic contraction of population sizes and geographic ranges of species that remain technically extant. It examined 27,500 vertebrate species and found that 32% showed range and population declines, with billions of individual animals lost. The Living Planet Index, published by WWF, tracks the abundance of monitored vertebrate populations globally. The 2022 report found an average population decline of 69% since 1970 across approximately 5,000 monitored species. Invertebrate declines are particularly concerning. A 2017 study of flying insect biomass in German Nature reserves found a 76% decline in total biomass over 27 years. A 2019 global analysis found that 41% of insect species are declining, with a projected extinction rate 8 times faster than mammals, birds, or reptiles. The primary drivers, habitat loss, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, and climate change, are all ongoing and all measurable. The concept of extinction debt means that the full toll of 20th century habitat loss will not be visible in the data for another 50 to 100 years, as populations too small to be viable eventually disappear. Dismissing extinction rate data as hyperbole is the intellectual equivalent of arguing with a speedometer. The instrument doesn't care how you feel about the number. It just reports what the wheels are doing. 29. When oceanographers began documenting that the ocean was absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and becoming more acidic, the initial public and policy response leaned heavily on a familiar intuition. The ocean is enormous. A change measurable in hundredths of a pH unit cannot possibly matter at that scale. That intuition is wrong in a way that requires understanding how pH works. A shift of 1/10 of a pH unit, which sounds trivially small, represents a 26% increase in hydrogen ion concentration, because pH is a logarithmic scale. Surface ocean pH has declined from approximately 8.2 to 8.1 since pre-industrial times. That 1/10 unit decline represents a 26% increase in acidity. The ocean has absorbed approximately 30% of the carbon dioxide emitted by human activities since industrialization. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid, which dissociates and increases hydrogen ion concentration. The primary biological impact is on carbonate chemistry. Many marine organisms, including oysters, mussels, sea urchins, certain plankton, and corals, build shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. As acidity increases, the saturation state of calcium carbonate minerals decreases, making it harder for organisms to build shells and causing existing shells to dissolve. Pteropods, small, free-swimming sea snails that are a critical food source for salmon, herring, and many commercially important fish, are already showing shell dissolution in areas of high acidification. A 2012 study of pteropods in the California Current found severe shell corrosion in live animals, directly attributable to ocean acidification. Oyster hatcheries in the Pacific Northwest experienced major larval mortality crises beginning around 2007. Research connected these events to upwelling of corrosive, low pH water. Several hatcheries have had to implement real-time pH monitoring and buffering systems to keep larvae alive. The geological record contains evidence of past ocean acidification events, but those occurred over thousands to tens of thousands of years. Current acidification is occurring approximately 100 times faster, compressing what would be a geological event into a human lifetime. If emissions continue on current trajectories, ocean pH could decline by 0.3 to 0.4 units by the end of this century, the most severe ocean acidification in at least 20 million years. Dismissing ocean acidification because the ocean is big is like insisting your blood pressure readings don't matter because your body contains a lot of blood. The volume is not the variable that kills you. 30 flash floods are consistently among the deadliest weather-related disasters in the United States. The warning systems exist. The meteorological science is mature. The characteristic warning signs have been documented for decades. People die anyway, in large numbers, because the conceptual gap between "it's not raining here" and "a wall of water is coming from 30 miles upstream" is one that human brains resist crossing. Flash floods do not require local rain. They require heavy rain, somewhere upstream, in terrain that channels water rapidly. By the time the flood arrives at your location, the storm that created it may have ended hours ago and may never have touched your visible sky. The Big Thompson Canyon flood in Colorado in 1976 killed 144 people. The storm producing the flood was localized on the upper watershed. Many victims in the lower canyon were unaware of any rainfall at all when the flood arrived. The event led to Climb to Safety public awareness campaigns in Colorado that are now standard in canyon country. In June of 2010, a flash flood in a campground in Albert Pike Recreation Area in Arkansas killed 20 people. A flood watch had been issued hours before the flood arrived. The campground had no evacuation system and was located in a canyon. Multiple warnings at the administrative level failed to produce a timely evacuation order. The physics of flash flooding are not subtle. In steep or impervious terrain, water accumulates in a watershed faster than it can infiltrate or discharge, creating a rapid rise in stream levels that can reach full force within minutes of peak rainfall. In narrow canyons, flood waves can travel faster than a running person and carry enough force to move vehicles, boulders, and trees. Only 6 inches of moving water can knock an adult off their feet. 2 feet of moving water can carry away most vehicles. Arid terrain is particularly vulnerable because dry, hardened soil generates rapid runoff. Desert flash floods can arrive in areas that receive essentially no local rainfall. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Turnaround, Don't Drown campaign, launched in 2003, specifically targets the behavior, driving into floodwaters, responsible for the majority of flash flood fatalities. Despite decades of campaigns and consistent data, the behavior remains the primary cause of those deaths. Driving around a road-closed barrier because it's not raining is not confidence. It is the terminal misapplication of the rule that only evidence you can personally see counts as real. 31, for most of the 20th century, biodiversity was treated as an aesthetic concern, a matter of ethics, sentiment, and the preferences of naturalists and wildlife enthusiasts. Species were going extinct. That was unfortunate. But the agricultural revolution and the industrial food system had largely decoupled humanity from dependence on wild ecosystems. That belief was incorrect. We had not decoupled from wild ecosystems. We had simply stopped noticing the services they were providing until those services began to fail. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a 4-year, 1,300-scientist global project completed in 2005, produced the most comprehensive evaluation of ecosystem service status ever undertaken. Its conclusion: approximately 60% of the ecosystem services evaluated were being degraded or used unsustainably. Pollination services provided by wild insects support the reproduction of over 75% of the world's flowering plant species and 35% of global food crop production. Wild pollinator populations, including thousands of bee, wasp, butterfly, moth, beetle, and fly species, are declining in parallel with managed honeybee populations, and they provide services that cannot be replaced by managed hive expansion alone. Natural pest control provided by predatory insects, birds, and bats is estimated to be worth $4.5 billion annually to United States agriculture alone. The loss of insectivorous bat populations from white nose syndrome, a fungal disease introduced from Europe around 2006, has been estimated to cost North American agriculture approximately $3.7 billion per year in increased pesticide costs and crop losses. Wild fisheries directly feed approximately 3.3 billion people globally as a primary protein source. The collapse of fish stocks is therefore not an economic inconvenience, but a food security emergency, particularly for coastal and island communities, where fish is the primary dietary protein. Plant genetic diversity held in wild relatives of crop species is the raw material for breeding programs that adapt agricultural varieties to new diseases, pests, and climate conditions. As the habitats harboring these genetic reservoirs disappear, the gene pool available for future crop improvement narrows. Scientific models of ecosystem collapse generally show nonlinear dynamics. Systems absorb biodiversity loss for extended periods with apparently modest consequences, then reach thresholds where additional losses trigger rapid, cascading failures. The challenge is that those thresholds are extremely difficult to predict in advance. Treating biodiversity as an idealist concern is like dismissing the bolts and structural members of a bridge as aesthetics, because the bridge is still standing, right up until the specific piece that mattered finally goes, and the question of whether you took the warnings seriously becomes permanently academic. Nature has been filing these reports for over a century. The inbox isn't the problem. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.